Hi, everyone. So today I'm talking with John Schultz Barnes. Now, you might not recognize him after 5 years with the Critique of Socionics video. He has been posting some other videos more recently. He's had a bit of a hair change over the 5 years. But yeah, John Schultz Barnes, I've been wanting to speak to him for a long, long time. I think I posted the comment on your video a year ago, and then so you messaged me out of the blue, say, "Hey, you wanna have a chat?" And yeah, totally up for it. So I'm excited to have you on here, John. I am.
I'm excited
So
to be here.
fantastic. And yeah, have we got any people watching? Yes. So anyone who's watching, feel free to ask any questions you like. We'll try to get to them at any natural or intuitive gaps in our conversation. I think that's doing it. But yeah, we were just speaking, John, before we went live about ENTP, because we both would identify as ENTP in the Myers-Briggs system. And you were interested in the point I was just making before, that I identify with most of the profiles, except for perhaps one, which I think sounds a bit more like the LIE in the Socionics system.
Okay. So I don't quite understand. So you mean like the way a certain person has described it? You're talking
Yes.
about a particular take on the ENTP. It sounded more like an ILE to you.
Yes, exactly.
I see. And who do you
Yeah,
know
well,
where
it
that
sounded
take was?
more like an.
So who
That
was that?
was on 16 Personality.
I see. Yeah. Yeah. So I thought I was kind of confused with what you had said, because when I think of the differences between the systems, right? The MBTI and Socionics. I think we're talking about the same thing. I think there are 16 types that we're talking about in different ways. And a lot of the descriptions can be better or worse. And I mean, there are a lot of bad descriptions out there. So it kind of confuses things, and it's like, yeah. But is that your take as well, that these are the same 16 types being described?
I think so. At the end of the day, they both come from Jung. They're both children, as it were, of Jung's attempts to describe these differences between people. They have certainly diverged over time in terms of what information people have gravitated towards. Some of the ideas have also changed. There's some, like, in my opinion, I think it's always good to take the good parts, but also be willing to break with some of the parts that don't quite make sense, to adapt and evolve a theory over time. But I think they're both trying, at the end of the day, to do the same thing, which is to understand type. Where I feel it can become more fundamentally different is in terms of how the types are put together and understood. Now, you're clearly a cognitive functions person. A lot of people who practice the Myers-Briggs don't talk about the functions so much, and they talk more about the dichotomies. That's how the test works, how it's tested. And so that can lead to certain differences. There are certain differences in the understandings of certain cognitive functions as well, which can also lead to difference. You were very right in pointing out that we don't call it cognitive function, we call it information metabolism element. And how we then understand the difference between, say, a cognitive function and information metabolism element, it leads to certain differences there. One is linked to either a metaphysical or epistemological basis. The other is talked about more in terms of a function, a process that goes on in the mind, which manifests in certain kinds of behaviors or certain attitudes, depending on who's describing it. Whether that could be, say, Catherine Thompson, as an example. She takes a certain approach, which could be different from what you may find in an MBTI manual.
Right.
So, yeah, certainly lots of differences there. But I do think there is I wouldn't say that they are fundamentally different, but I think as a result of different interpretations, it's very hard to sort of just smush them together and treat them as if they're the same with the same consequences. It's more of the same species in the process of diverging and just about reaching the point where you can't really crossbreed them anymore.
So I'm now realizing that I kind of I kind of am moving more towards the socionics way of understanding the types. So I made that point in that video a long time ago that this idea of information metabolism, like there's a kind of ontological move there in saying that kind of reality is organized in these kind of different ways. And so therefore there are different parts in the mind that that deal with different parts of reality. Is that a fair kind of description of how the informational elements works?
I think that is mostly fair, yes. The way I see it is very similar to that. I'd say that there are, well, if we take this viewpoint that all we can really interact with the world is the information that comes our way, then it starts to make sense as something which can exist as different domains of information. I think it's a more, certainly, if you take sort of a scientific perspective, we could say, well, how do you know the world's broken down that sort of way? That's when it becomes a whole different question. You have to battle to suddenly prove that the world is made of sensation, that everything ahead is made of intuition, etc. All we can really say is that these categories have something meaningful to us in terms of how we make sense of the world, in terms of how we then interact. And these, we can see the meaning in that in terms of the categories other people for that history have used to differentiate different kinds of people. And if we look at it in that way, then I'd say, okay, you have these domains of information. Some people are better at interacting with certain domains than others. Some people know how to take the information and process it in a way that leads them to make an appropriate decision and enact a certain appropriate behavior to the situation, and others don't quite meet the mark.
So I think that's a brilliant move, and I think it's something that Jung would probably resist, because he and I don't know, maybe I can't speak for Jung, but there's this tradition in Western thought of empiricism, right, where it's like, no, it's like everything is sense data, right? That's the empirical move. I'm going to close my door real quick.
Okay.
The empirical move is to say that everything is sense data, and then meaning is a projection of the mind. And so there's a potential in socionics I see as seeing meaning as objective, which I love because you don't have the experience of projecting meaning onto something. You have the experience when you experience something that's meaningful. And maybe I might be cramming meaning into intuition, and maybe I don't know if it doesn't belong there, but when you cram meaning, when you experience meaning, you experience it as being acted upon. You don't experience it as projecting. So, are you familiar with phenomenology?
Yes, to some degree.
So it's kind of like what I see socionics doing is taking a phenomenological worldview and describing it kind of scientifically. Like, you guys are really doing like the science that Husserl and Heidegger were moving towards.
Yeah,
so that's cool.
No, I think there's certainly this idea of a leading function as being a sort of lens through which we interpret events, what parts or aspects of our very complex reality we actually focus on, I think is an important part of the phenomenology. What we actually assign meaning and importance to then shapes our experiences. So it certainly plays into that part of philosophy. And I think there's often this difficulty with people who try to apply the empirical lens to everything. They then try to explain things which actually cannot really be explained by empirical observation, because a lot of it's coming from just our subjective experiences of our realities.
So I've been trying to get subjectivity out. I don't want to refer to subjectivity at all. So, okay. And I don't know why. So there's a move there saying like there are parts of reality that cannot be explained empirically, right? But those parts of reality aren't then just the domain of subjectivity, in my opinion. So a number is not empirically observable at all. The number one, right? but we say, but it's also not subjective either. So, and it's a move a lot of people will have when they're trying to deconstruct materialism, when they're trying to show how materialism is not a valid cosmology. They'll refer to subjective experiences like love, but it's like a number is not subjective and it's not material. So it's like you have something in your cosmology that's just you can't do anything with. And so, and what a lot of materialists will then do is saying like, oh no, well, numbers are just a fiction of the mind. And it's like, when you do that, it's like what then is not a fiction? Why? Because even sense data is experienced subjectively. So it's like you have nothing that's not subjective. Does my point make sense? I don't know. I'm kind of inarticulate.
Well, no, I think you are articulating. I think, and it's also something which Socionics starts with, grappling with that difference. What would be used is what we call the external and internal dichotomy, not the extroverted introverted. It's instead it describes intuition versus sensation, but also logic versus ethics, where both sensation and logic have a certain external quality, and that's that it can be shared with others. You know what one is, I know what one is. You know what a white wall looks like, I know what a white wall looks like. So they both of them share that shareability factor. Whereas if you go to something which we want to call internal, that'll be far more different. That'll be what feels meaningful to you. What do you like? What do you dislike? That can't so easily and readily be shared with others. You can.
I think the stream is a little crashy.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah,
I can hear you now.
Sorry about that. Must have been my fault.
No problem.
Okay. So what I was saying is that sometimes with internal information, you can develop a sudden kinship with someone because you happen to feel the same way about things. And the reason that forms a special kinship is because you don't expect people to feel the same way. When they do, it's a positive surprise. But you do expect people to see the same things that you are seeing. If you point at a white wall and someone doesn't see the same white wall as you, you're not disappointed because they don't, or you don't not. You're not expecting to be positively surprised that they saw the same white wall as you. If they don't see it, there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
So that's where I'd say there's a clear difference there between external and internal information. The other split is what we call detached and involved information, whether you actually feel it, experience it vivaciously, or you don't. You only think about it. And this is where the number again comes in. The number, you can't see it, you can't interact with it vivaciously. You can interact with certain manifestations of it. I've got one mug. That's a manifestation of the concept of one. But we do think about one. What is oneness? What is a singularity? And so that's where you say ideas of numbers, the category of something which is one, that would be something which is logic.
Logic, really? Wait, so, okay, I'm sorry. So we have vivaciousness versus what is the opposite of vivaciousness in that dichotomy?
The lack thereof.
Lack thereof.
So, yeah, if you feel something or you think about it.
So, and is vivaciousness and sensation and lack of vivaciousness and intuition related?
Yeah.
They are.
In the same way, logic lacks vivacity, ethics is vivacious.
So, okay, I think that's, I love the connection between vivaciousness and sensation, and I love the connection between lack of vivaciousness and intuition. That fits right in with my understanding, because what I say is intuition perceives heaven and sensation perceives earth. Heaven is invisible, earth is the manifestation of heavenly principles.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. But I think I'm not on board with logic versus ethics for thinking versus feeling. And I'm curious where that comes from, because this was kind of a critique I had of Michael's book as well, is this: we kind of don't emphasize the difference between the rational functions and the irrational functions. So like intuition and sensation and the thinking and feeling functions. I think there's a kind of, because in socionics, right, we have these symbols, right? The triangle, the heart thing, and all of that. And it's kind of like, oh yeah, there's these 8 things out there. I think there's not 8 things out there. I think there's 2 things out there. Or in socionics, you might say there's 4 things out there. Sorry, go ahead.
Identity and expression.
Identity and expression, exactly. Right. Yeah. Heaven and earth. And in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Like, that's what's out there. And the intuition and sensation functions, in my understanding, perceive heaven and earth respectively. Probably a better way of saying that is actually perception is the perception of the relationship between heaven and earth. So you're all, in my understanding, you're always using sensation and intuition to perceive anything. Because everything you perceive as a unity between heaven and earth. You perceive that this marker is a particular marker, and you perceive that it is a type of marker, right? So I'm sorry, we got on this because we were talking about logic versus ethics. Where is that? What is that describing? I don't understand.
Well, I think the difference between rationality and irrationality, I think this is something that David Hume caught on to. And that's, you can't derive an ought from an is. Something is a certain way, you can't say it should be that way or it should be different. You could come to that independently, but you can't just derive one from the other. And I think that is the basis of rationality and irrationality. Rationality, implicit to it, is a sense of ought. And that ought can be, feels right, feels wrong, it's correct, it's incorrect. It could function better, it could be improved, it's useless. Whereas when you talk about sensation, intuition, something feels meaningful. When I say something feels meaningful, when something seems to be a likely or an outcome that must happen, it's not a sense that it should happen, or it just is going to happen, it will be. And something feels possible, or just it could potentially happen. It is one of possibilities. Sensation, this is in front of me. This computer's in front of me. I can see it. There's no saying it should be there or shouldn't be there. And that is where I think you get that difference of perception and judgment. That's why I actually think that perception and judgment actually is a good terminology to use.
Right. That's
and
perfect.
Now, I would say also then separating out logic and ethics. Well, your judgments, your sense of oughts, can be shareable but non-vivacious. That would be the logical side. If it meets set criteria, we can all share in those criteria. We've read the rule book. We know if it meets that criteria, and we could work out from that criteria that said thing is incorrect. But if you go to ethics, you can say, well, it's not about shared criteria. I feel a certain way, and that feels wrong to me. And that is something which I can't just think about. I actually feel it. It could enrage me. It could make me feel very disappointed. If it's right, it could make you feel exhilarated. And so that's where I think logic and ethics sort of naturally divide.
I see. So there's the functions then are derived from the combination of vivacious and lack, and I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Vivacious and lack, and then perception and judgment, and you can derive the 4 functions, and then if you add internal versus external, you get 8 functions from that, or 8 information.
No,
is that right?
No, that just gives you the 4. There are 3 dichotomies. Describe 4. You can make a matrix out of it. You can make 2 different matrices depending on which 2 you're using, and then the other 2 will form diagonals. So even though the opposite and the other 2 share in 1, and Socionics is full of these triads of dichotomies interacting. I just think it's an intuitive way of understanding these differences. Plato set it up with like the idea of reason against one's emotional desires. Hume talked about the difference between feeling sympathy for people and actually having more reasoned, logical ways of going about things. And the idea of heaven and earth, the idea of being down to earth or up in the clouds, very much rooted in our language and our understanding of differences between people.
Right. So I think this there's an evaluative function to the judgment functions.
Yes.
Right. And I think that evaluation needs a more technical description of what's going on in the evaluation. I think logic and ethics is kind of a good intuitive way of understanding what's going on, because how the thinking function ends up evaluating will look logical to people, like it. And it's like, the field of logic, there's a reason, it's full of INTPs or LIEs, LII, right. So so I have this idea of heaven and earth, right? Identity and expression, and sensation and intuition kind of perceive those two things, or they perceive the relationship between two things when they perceive anything. The marker is the type marker, and it is this particular marker that's filled with these particular colors, right? But then I have the question between this marker and this marker. And it's like there's some kind of standard between these two markers. There's I'm really struggling to find the language of what fundamentally. I think the marker analogy is bad.
There's a quality they have in common.
There's a quality they have in common, right? So that would be the identity. The identity is in common. The expression is not in common. I think the way we talk about extroverted thinking and introverted feeling, that axis, it emphasizes the identity by the expression. So the expression is what makes the identity in the relationship between markers. So that kind of evaluation sees the differences between the markers. And the introverted thinking, extroverted feeling type, because it sees the identity as related to what's not expressed. The identity is evaluated by the identity. They see the analogy between the markers, because the expression, they're like, it's it's included, but it's not the identity. That's kind of the merciful side. It's like, it's not part of the identity, so we're not going to evaluate it based on that, but we're going to bring it in. So it's like, oh yes, they go along well together. That's the kind of bringing them together move that extroverted feeling does. And so I think there's no kind of morality in that move, right? And I could almost describe that as it's, you can see how tight it is with intuition and sensation with this reference to identity and expression, right? But I think when you have the concept of marker is a mountain.
You like your mountains.
The concept of marker is a mountain, right? There's the heavenly identity of marker, and then there's everything that fills that. So there's this multiplicity of markers. There's like a bunch of markers, and some of the markers don't fit on the mountain. Some of them are like more like a pen. When you perceive a pen, I think the relationship of morality, all morality is just like, where is it on the mountain? That's like, do you know what? I'm kind of feeling a lot of images and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Does the marker belong on the mountain? To belong on the mountain, there's some it is a share in the identity of marker to belong on the mountain. So here's where I ask you something. Do you like my marker?
Do I like your marker?
Is this a good marker?
That's a bad marker. That's a bad marker. It does not belong, because it does not belong on the peak. It can stay on the mountain No, it probably needs to be on a different mountain, honestly.
That's very evaluative of you.
Yes, exactly. It's like that cup, it's not even a marginal marker. That's just some other category.
Wrong. It's wrong. It does not qualify.
Exactly.
As
So it's like we see a kind of quote unquote violence to morality. Like it's like, oh, it's judgmental. And it's because like we have these examples from like scripture, right? Of like let's say there's this one guy, King Uzziah in the Bible. He enters into the Holy of Holies, and then he gets leprosy, right? And so what that's showing you is that he does not belong in the Holy of Holies. So it's like when things enter into the Holy of Holies, when things enter into the top of the mountain that don't belong there, like it's not good for them. They need to be where they should be in categories, in the relationships between categories.
Only the Kohen Gadol at certain times of the year can go into the Holy of Holies.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, because they're not the Holy of Holies. They're, God is the Holy of Holies.
Yeah.
Or like he is what sits on the Holy of Holies.
Yeah.
And what that is then like the thing that's beyond heaven, right? And it gets theological pretty quickly because I think theological and biblical cosmology is the best cosmology in my opinion.
It's going to get theological at some point because theology is another way in which we derive meaning from our experiences. Whether you are religious or not, one can still accept that these stories, these frameworks of understanding, narratives can be used to explain experiences we come across, and they then provide some sort of directional guide through those experiences. They provide an ideal. So Socionics is going to get theological at some point if you explore it on that level, and it's very much open to that level. It's open to other levels as well. But this is an interesting point. You were talking about the dichotomy of identity versus expression, and tying up identity perhaps more to intuition and expression perhaps more to sensation. Now, the point I was making, and I think you also got that point, was that when I showed you the mug, and I said, that's a marker. How is this marker? Maybe I was leading you into a evaluative by saying, how is it? But the point is, there is this idea, you're framing identity as what I would frame as being a category, where there's certain rules or criteria. If you don't match those rules or criteria, you're not on the mountain. That would speak to me as actually being more about logic. And it fits more into what I was saying before, that you could share those criteria with other people. It would qualify as external, even if it's detached. People can know what the criteria are, and they'll not put their mugs on the marker mountain. And that's why I say maybe it's the case that where you're describing identity, it is actually perhaps more to do with logic. It makes sense to me. I think actually makes a lot of sense to an ILE in a way, because when I think about the information elements, I think about how they combine together into blocks. We have a lot to do with blocking, and almost nothing in reality exists outside of a block. As soon as you put it into a realistic form, it starts to block with something else. So when I think of a structure or rule, right, a category, it's also going to be blocked with either intuition, extroverted intuition, or extroverted sensation. So what does that look like? Well, what do theorists often do? They look at various examples, various possibilities, and they trying to find rules to describe and decide what is correct or incorrect about those possibilities. The grand theorist, as it were, say an Albert Einstein or a Baruch Spinoza, whoever it is trying to find a certain number of categories to explain the greatest number of possibilities. That would be introverted logic blocked with extroverted intuition, I would say. The grand theory of everything is all possibilities under these rules.
Yeah, and we're awesome.
There is an evaluatory and also a perceptive link together there.
Yeah. No, I know. ENTPs, man, we're the best. No, that's very interesting. I think my issue with ethics is the term ethics is that ethics, like, it makes me think of philosophy. You know, it makes me think of ethical thinkers, and I think a lot of ethical thinkers are dominant thinking types. So it's like, I think the judgment, the logical judgment, right? This idea, like, this doesn't belong on the mountain because it doesn't meet a standard. It doesn't meet an identity, whether that identity is evaluated based on the expression of the identity, or the identity itself determines whether it's introverted or extroverted thinking. But I think there is no evaluative, let's say, there's no exclusive judgment that goes on in the feeling functions. I think the feeling functions are an inclusion. That's how you get things on the mountain. I think the thinking functions push things away from the mountain.
Interesting. I would have said that both ethics and logic, depending whether it's more introverted or extroverted, according to more of a Socionics definition, would have both exclusive and inclusive qualities to it. One thing I say is, yeah, it is a great irony that ethical philosophers tend actually to be logical types. Right. But I think that also gets to the heart of it as well, that, you know, when we talk about ethics, are we talking about just the ethics everyone experiences, you know, that almost everyone experiences, where that feels wrong, that feels right? There's no formality to it, no discipline. They just know, they just feel.
Sentimental.
Yeah, sentimental, exactly. Or we're talking about the field of ethics. And the field of ethics is where usually a philosopher or someone that, or it could be a lawyer, is trying to put together some sort of rational explanation of what we seem to or deem to be ethics. And usually what they're checking is, first of all, their logical model, and then does that actually make sense to how we actually feel about things? They're usually checking both. So I would say that was also the exception that kind of even proves the rule, that the reason why logical people are going into ethics is because they're trying to apply logic to what already exists within us, right, which is
true sentiment.
Ethics. Yes, but it does lead to a sort of irony. Right. And now what I would say about the reason why I think perhaps thinking and feeling doesn't quite work as well, maybe it does work to some degree, but I think because when I said, you know, either information you think about it or you feel it, you feel something in a sensory way as well as an emotional way. You can think about something in an intuitive, abstract way, or you can think about it in terms of a logical way. And that's why I think maybe logic and ethics could apply better. Is logic and ethics the best wording? I wouldn't necessarily say so either, because you can find examples of logic which, you know, just the discipline of just how concepts fit together isn't necessarily going to be the logic of practicality, of pragmatism, of business logic. So words, labels, I'm very open to finding better labels for these concepts. Entirely, there's no need for an orthodoxy on that, only that whatever you find makes enough sense for enough people to share in it to communicate the same language. It's not the be all and end all. When I was talking about the selective and inclusive part, both logic and ethics, this is what I think introversion and extroversion is also quite a bit about. This is also a big departure from Jung. Jung is about subject versus object, whereas Socionics, I think, and it's not made very clear. I had to think about it quite a bit to try and get what is it these things all have in common. I think all the extroverted elements have in common is this acquisitive aspect. They're taking on more things. There's a breadth over depth. Whereas if you look at the introverted, they all seem to have a selective quality, and they're refining the quality of what they're having rather than expanding the quantity. And it's an important concept to have, quality versus quantity. It's not just less and more. Quantity and quality, they're both expanding in different ways, in different forms. One's outwards, one is going inwards and refining inwards for depth, breadth and depth.
Sorry, go on. Sorry.
But that in that line of thought, you apply it to thinking and feeling, or ethics and logic. Well, it's interesting that the extroverted kinds of judgment are what we call dynamic, and the introverted forms of judgment are what we call static. Because that, if something is introverted and static and a judgment, that's when it becomes more criteria, or it needs to be this or not. Whereas when it comes to extroverted judgment, it becomes dynamic. That becomes more situational, more about how is this working, or what is it effect is it having. And it doesn't really matter whether it feels necessarily consistently right or wrong. It just needs to feel, it could, for instance, feel good in that moment, or can work best in that moment. So this is where we split things up into extroverted logic, introverted logic, extroverted ethics, introverted ethics. And this is where this does, I think, fit what Jung was saying when he was trying to describe thinking and feeling with introverted thinkers, extroverted thinkers. The introverted thinker has these sort of articles of faith. This is their structure. They are not going to take in things which disagree with their structure, contradict their structure. Whereas the extroverted thinker is going to be the pragmatist, the one who just wants to make anything work, even if that isn't internally consistent. When it comes to feeling, to extroverted ethics and introverted ethics, it takes a similar parallel form. So introverted ethics and socionics, it's very much about personal relationships, how close one should be to others. This person I'm close to. I'm going to treat this person like a friend because I feel a close connection with them. That person, I don't like their character. I feel there's something off about their character. I'm going to perhaps keep them at a distance or not invite closeness with them. And so that's more of a static quality. Are you good? Are you not? Are you not good? Are you not quite right for me? And there may be ways in between. You may say you're more of an acquaintance, but you're not going to be a real friend. I mean, you're never going to get into my close circle. When it comes to extroverted ethics, it's how you're feeling in the moment. So you may be angry at someone and shout, "I hate you!" But the next minute, you say, "I didn't really mean it. I was just really upset." Someone with introverted ethics would be horrified.
Right.
A close friend, because however they're feeling doesn't matter. They are my friend. That is fixed. That is set in stone. That's the staticness. And so you apply that to inclusion and exclusion. Well, introverted ethics is going to be setting its markers quite clearly. Both introverted and ethics and introverted logic set their markers quite clearly, and then they're not meant to change. Whereas the extroverted ones are meant to be more of a flowing continuum of different things, where lots of things could be acceptable or unacceptable depending on the situation.
I think that's the thing about introverted ethics. As you and I as ILEs, I've often remarked that, like, I don't know how to evaluate whether I like someone. Like, someone will ask me, like, "Oh, what do you think of David or whatever?" And I'm like, I have no idea, man. Like, I get along with them sometimes. Sometimes I don't get along with them. Like, I don't know where he belongs. It's funny. But so I wanted to talk about this subject versus object versus, and then as opposed to inclusion versus exclusion, or not inclusion versus exclusion. Is it inclusion versus exclusion? Is that how you guys were talking about?
Well, I sort of just chucked that out there just now. We just
one versus many is a little bit more.
That is, as again, that is one example of. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say one versus many, because I rarely think there's just one. Sometimes it can be one, but I think it's just this general idea of refining, reducing the amount, because what remains is better in quality.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I think that we can bridge that gap pretty. Like, those are pretty related. Yeah. Like, because it's like subject. If we just map that onto identity versus expression, right? There's always more that's not part of an identity than is the identity. There's always more outside of a category than inside the category. So that's why, and so there's always going to be more, even on the mountain, let's say, like, there's always going to be more lower on the mountain than higher on the mountain. So that's how I kind of bridge that gap. Is like, the subject versus object thing is just the pattern of identity versus expression, which works for everything applied to a person.
One thing I'd wonder, you say also some things are lower on the mountain, some things are higher on the mountain.
Yeah, so a friend would be like higher on the mountain if we're talking about identity versus expression as applied to a person, where we get subjectivity. A friend is closer on the mountain, and a stranger is farther away on the mountain, or at least they should be. And that's when the thinking and feeling functions come in and say, like, oh, I don't know where on the mountain is this person going to be.
I think that works for introverted ethics. I'm not sure it works for introverted logic, because for introverted logic, it goes into, does it meet the criteria? Does it not? There's not, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. That's not usually satisfactory to introverted logic. When it gets to, if things start being treated like a sort of continuum, like on the mountain, that's when I'm thinking you're getting multiple criteria that have to be met, and maybe it's satisfying some of the criteria but not all the criteria. So you're talking about the marker, for instance. You break that down. It's not that it's a little bit more markerish, a little bit less markerish. It's that it has this A, B, and C qualities of marker, but doesn't have D, E, and F qualities of marker.
Yes. And so that's perfect. That's perfect. But that's when the idea of the city wall comes in. That there's also there's a barrier on the mountain, right? And just as there's barriers between categories, and like, you know, it's why you have a city wall. Like, there's an exclusive element. So this, I'm going to try to describe it, how it works with introverted logic, how you can relate to people through introverted logic and extroverted ethics. And to my terms it would be merciful towards expression and rigorous with identity. So you experience someone and you don't know whether they're, you know, where they belong on the mountain. So you invite them to the city gate. Like that's the merciful move. It's like you come up all the way to the city gate, and but then nobody gets in the mountain into the city unless they pass the test. And that's like the classic thing about the INFJ. Like, one of the memes of the Myers-Briggs community is like the INFJ door slam, where it's like the INFJ was like, come, and then like, oh, never mind, get out. Like, get out. Like, that's the process I'm talking about. It's like they come up all the way to the city gates. People try to get in the walls, and then the INFJ is like, out of here. So what am I describing? So yeah, when the INFJ, like, when you have a relationship and when you get in the city gates, like, that's when you see a real hierarchy evolve with the INFJ. And you can, like, I'm using the INFJ as an example. It's for any extroverted feeling, introverted thinking type, but the way that you get to the top of the mountain with an introverted thinking, you know, whatever introverted logic type, is by being the same person. Like, and we talk about it in kind of Christian terms. It would be like it's one soul animating two bodies. Like, that's the way they think about it. But with an introverted feeling person, it's like they are evaluating based on expression before you get into the city gates, and there's no hierarchy once you get past the city gates. It's just like, oh, perfect, like you are holy to me, and yet you are not my identity.
Okay.
That's how I think about it working.
I think there is one thing that we looked at in Socionics is, that say criteria for whether you say relate to someone or not, whether you are part of a group, part of my circle, part of my family, as it were, or not. One thing we have been looking at introverted logic and introverted ethics to make that distinction. Normally, what we think is that introverted logic, are you part of do you share in the same principles as me? Do you have the same worldview? Or are you not, or do you not see the world in the same way as me? And then there could be more of a distance created as a result. When it comes to introverted ethics types, it tends to be far more about, do I like you at the end of the day? Do I think you are Are your intentions good, regardless of what principles you may actually be sticking to? And whereas I find that with those who are more extroverted ethics or introverted logic valuing, they're not really thinking so much about the intentions at the end of the day. And that would perhaps lead to one of the big differences. There is also, I was saying before how the introverted logic there isn't really any sort of continuum there. That's also something which extroverted ethics shares. Whereas both introverted ethics and extroverted logic, those two, are more continuum-y in terms of their approach. And that's one thing I've been thinking about in terms of looking at differences in values between people. The people who instead say, that's exactly it. That is 100% what it's about. And those who say it depends, really. It could be, sometimes it exists, but other times it's also that. And you see those values showing up in how people express themselves. And these are differences in communication, misunderstandings as a result. That is what I think. I came up with this terminology of clarity seeking and integrity seeking. And it's the idea that if you're integrity seeking, it's not about how clearly divided up it is. It's not about digital. It's about representing the full analog, all the white noise. Whereas for the clarity seekers, no, they don't want all the white noise. They want to draw lines around things. They want to show what is the black and what is the white. And so when an extroverted ethics type is expressing, they're not expressing vague emotions. They're trying to express how they're feeling in a communicative way. This is great. That's terrible. It's not, and that can often lead to exaggeration, because sometimes how something isn't necessarily 100% great, 100% terrible. But so there is an aspect of that clarity, that digitization of data in communication for both extroverted ethics and introverted logic. Whereas the opposite can be seen for both introverted ethics and extroverted logic. The more it depends how much you are my close friend, you are not as close, get far away from me as much as possible sort of person. And then extroverted logic, how well does this work? Well, that's an improvement on what it was before. It might not be 100% great, but it's maybe at 20% optimacy rather than 10% optimization, etc., etc. Trying to think how that. I believe that linked to what you said before, and I've forgotten why.
I was talking about relationship. I was trying to talk about how introverted thinking or introverted logic, what I would call the rigorous identity evaluation, how that creates, how you can describe how someone would have a relationship with someone and determine where they are on the mountain, based solely on that. Right. Yeah, that was my attempt.
That's one thing I'd ask you. Are you quite picky about who's on your mountain?
So, no, right? Because I'm. It's interesting. That's been one of the points in my life that I've had to learn painfully. I've had to. It's interesting. I now have to. I let anyone come onto my mountain, and I go hang out with them outside the city walls, and I'm having a good time. We're talking and stuff, and then it's like, okay, there's a quality. Let's say it's like a relationship with a girl. Let's say it's like, okay, girlfriendness. It's like, is this person, for me, it's like I evaluate. It's like, does this person meet girlfriendness? And so I'm very rigorous with the identity of girlfriendness now. Like, that's how I have had to compensate for the fact that I'm just always hanging out with people on my mountain. It's like I have to have this rigorous thing. It's not a And so I've kind of been confused in certain relationships of calling something girlfriendness, like having a girlfriend who's like, I realized after I was like, I'm not even that close with this person, So that's been something that I've noticed about myself, which would then be described in Socionics as I forget what the name is for the opposite of your third function.
Your when you say opposite, do you mean
Opposite orientation and extroversion.
Oh, okay, fine, suggestive.
Suggestive function?
Oh, so when you
Or
say third, as in third in the four function stack. Okay, vulnerable.
Sorry. So my conflicting type. The dominant function of my conflicting type is my what information element?
Introverted ethics.
But what's the name for that?
Oh, it could be ESI or EII.
I'm not asking it well. Like, what is the name for that information element in my stack?
Oh, the vulnerable function.
The vulnerable function, right? So it would be just what I'm describing to you about this difficulty with like having a girlfriend that I'm not too close with even is a symptom of what you guys would describe as the vulnerable introverted feeling function or vulnerable introverted.
And also say to be clear, there's a lot of misconception around that. I think there's also a problem with the labeling of these concepts. The vulnerable function is not a point of pain. It's a point almost like a blind spot. You don't realize.
Interesting.
And where you actually feel pain is in the suggestive function, often as a result of the vulnerable function. So
yes, absolutely.
So a perfect example, Eiis, you're in a relationship with someone you don't actually feel very close to. You're not necessarily treating it with a level of closeness and intimacy, which the other person may like. It leads to harsh arguments and an ugly breakup, which is very uncomfortable and harsh and makes you feel very sort of judged by the other person. That hits your introverted sensation because now you're no longer comfortable in a sort of a warm, accepting environment. But the introverted ethics isn't really necessarily a lesson learned. It's like, what is this thing keeps on causing me to get into trouble all the time? Oh, that. Ooh, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
This sort of judgmental, close the gate sort of person. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I asked you, are you picky? Eiis are one of the least picky about who they hang out with in that sense. They're not really making those judgments. In fact, even if you push them to make those judgments, they'll try to appeal to something else like, oh, well, everyone seems to think they're very cool.
Yeah.
I sort of like their company, I guess. They're fun to hang out with. So often it's hard for me to realize there's a difference between liking someone's company and liking a person. Those sorts of things, it's hard to really pick out. So that's it. And the reason why that is, yes, an absence of introverted ethics is an important part of that. But also, in terms of enforcing these sorts of boundaries, saying who's on the mountain, who isn't, that's where I think the perception also comes in. That then flavors how it is used. So, perfect example, if we look at deltas versus gammas, does that say an EII, like an INFP, not entirely, but a bit like an INFP, versus what should, if we assume a one-to-one correlation, which isn't, but should be like an ISFP, right? Both introverted ethics, but one with extroverted sensation, one with extroverted intuition.
Right.
They are meant to represent in Socionics the difference between harsh judgment and good faith judgment. The idea being good faith, I don't like what I'm seeing from you. I think you might not be a good person, but I'm willing to give you a chance, give you the benefit of the doubt to see if you might actually be a good person and I was wrong. I could see a potential of you that's not being shown in your behavior and in your conduct at the moment. So I want to maybe bring out that potential a bit more to be a better person, whatever it is. Whereas you take harsh judgment, you did X, you are a scumbag, get out of my life. And there's a big difference there in terms of what perceptions are feeding the judgment is the important thing. For the INFP, the EII, they are really, although they conceive in particular actions, you did X, they're really wanting to look at what is the potential here. And is there actually a potential here that actually maybe they're wrong in their judgment? Maybe they're trying to keep it open for more possibility to come through, to be actualized. Whereas,
because it's like, sorry, go ahead. It's like the INFP isn't seeing the person directly. Like they're seeing like almost like every person in each person that they see. That's how I think about it. That's why I said in my symbolism of the INFP video, it's like they are the type that has the most sympathy for the margin, because it's like they want to give every single person a shot. And like it's different from the ISFP because the ISFP has the directness. It's like, but the INFP, it's like every person is just an instantiation of a more general pattern. So there's a weird, almost like introverted thinking, extroverted feeling thing. It's like the INFP almost sees like everyone is the same, and like it's almost like the INFP is like just everyone come into the throne room. That's how I see it.
Interesting.
But it's not everyone's the same because like they have that particularity too. So it's like, I don't know. It's hard.
We are aligned in their understanding of the behavior.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we're aligned in our explanation of the behavior. So,
right.
And what I would have thought, and this is something like which from talking to Eiis in my life, I haven't really seen this idea that they see each person as like everyone else. It's
that's a bad way of bad way of saying it.
For me, it's almost the opposite. It's that they're trying to understand each individual person on their own merits, and really trying to give people enough space and opening to allow that true understanding of the person to come about, to come into fruition. They're trying to give that more of a chance, and they struggle with setting boundaries because they actually want to give each person that chance. They actually struggle with actually saying, "Get out of my life." They often keep on trying to give someone another chance when they're assessing their character towards someone. At the same time, they can very quickly make judgments in terms of who actually has potential and they really want to explore more, and who they're perhaps not quite seeing that potential from. So it's the idea of saying no, pushing them that way, that distance away, is actually quite difficult for a lot of EIIs. Whereas for an ESI, that's very easy. The problem for them is them reconsidering their position once they've made it from said action.
I think we disagree on the behavior of the ESI though. If the ISFP is, I think there is that same merciful move. I think they can see the hurt more clearly. That's how I think about it. It's like if you hurt the ISFP, they feel it more intensely. They feel it more as a personal attack. That's how I conceptualize it. But I haven't thought too much about it, so I don't know.
I don't disagree with what you just said. I don't. I would say for the ESI, it's not all or nothing really either. There is room for nuance in that. They can reconsider if something is brought before them,
right?
But they're not inclined to give that opportunity.
Right.
They're not inclined to consider alternative possibilities until they've actually seen it in front of them. So if you go before said ESI and they're able to let you actually in, and they can see your contrition, whatever else it is, they may be caused to rethink. Whereas you take, say, an ILI, INTJ, that may be a lot more difficult to actually change their mind on your character because their introverted ethics is less developed. It's actually it's more all nothing. That can be the sort of person where, when hurt, they will just cut themselves off from everything and just become almost reclusive from people who could hurt them in personal relationships. That you see that all or nothing extreme behavior in more of the mobilizing function than in the leading function, because it's not in so many nuances.
Yeah, and I've noticed that in myself. Like my uncomfortability. I'm not comfortable with my role. It's like I don't know if I'm offensive or really easy to get along with. Like I have this kind of all or nothing thing. It's like, man, like either like I'm really unpleasant as a person, and like lots of people like have difficulty interacting with me, or it's like I need to think of myself as someone who like needs to get along with everybody. So that's the mobilizing function, right?
Yeah, you're cycling between a sense that either you are a social pariah who everyone's eventually going to, or you're actually a uniquely charismatic and impressive person who everyone's going to admire, and you cycle between both. And you, when you're in the bad state, it's the former. When you're in the good state, it's the latter. And you try to go towards the latter until something goes wrong, and then you assume the former again. This is that sort of cycle of overconfidence and then that loss of confidence we see with the mobilizing function. It's trying to stick its neck out, push out to become more confident, then something goes wrong. It's not quite never going to get there like the suggestive function, it's always pushing and reaching to get there to that point.
Yeah.
Then it becomes overweening, becomes hubristic.
Yes, hubristic is a good term. I love that because it's got that mythological character. I think that's a good amount of content. I think an hour is going to be fun to watch for people. Do you want to go through? I don't know if there's like questions.
Yeah, let's do that. So, DJ Granville, what type is he? Yeah. John identifies as ILE. I haven't seen anything to contradict that. So, yeah, we're going for ILE for the time being, certainly. Let's see. I wonder if Zara likes the beard. She's not sure yet. She's still thinking. My mum said I shouldn't have shaved off the sides. I thought it looked like a bushman. I thought I'd go for more goatee. My grandmother does not like it. She doesn't want any beard on me. She wants me to be clean shaven. So lots of at the moment contradicting opinions from various women in my life who have opinions on my beard. My dad seems to like it though, so that's good. Let's see, what else are people saying? Let's see.
I think DJ Granville commented on my shirt choice.
It's a good shirt.
Seems like a high censor. I did not buy this shirt though. It's not my choice. So
but that's the thing. People often reach judgments of people based on choices they didn't themselves actually make. We don't actually exercise nearly as much control over our own lives as external observers assume.
Right.
People say that about my clothing choices. My mum's a fashion stylist. What's Leah saying? Leah's saying you could discern your emotions in a logical way. For example, I think I feel this way. What criteria does that fall under? Where did it originate? How could this affect the outcome? When someone says, I think I feel this way, that suggests someone who doesn't quite know how they feel, but they're trying to put together a hypothesis for what they feel. So that could be a logical person trying to figure out how they feel. But you often still says, I think I do this. In that context, it usually means I'm not really sure. I currently believe that's what I have. If you say I think something, that's like the shadow of a belief. It's like you're not quite confident you actually feel that way. So that could indicate weaker ethics, perhaps. Not sure what you think, John. Any?
I think that I would put that in the extrovert intuitive category. A lack of stability, honestly. So I put that as like almost like an ENFP and ENTP thing. I think I feel this way.
I think
not an ENFP thing, maybe, because ENFPs they can have quite difficulty rejecting their feelings. They can have difficulty rejecting their evaluations because of their mobilizing extroverted thinking. Being rigorous with the expression of things.
I think I certainly think there's an extrovert intuition part there, because I think extrovert intuition is more likely to invite a speculation. Like, I think it could be this. Right. I think I could feel this way. I think I feel that. And they may offer that without necessarily being really sure that is correct and that's thought through, because they're just throwing the possibility out there. So I do think that saying you think something to indicate you're not quite sure yet, but you're willing to talk about it before you're entirely sure, is very much in extrovert intuition territory.
Also, INTPs too. I could see INTPs saying that, like it's like, I don't know what I feel. Like, I have doubt about everything. It's like, now you want to ask me how I feel? It's like
Yes. Well, that's an interesting point. One of the reasons why I think the INPs, LIIs, EIIs, and Socionics are most likely to have that sense of, I don't know anything, I'm just doubtful of everything, is actually related to an absence of sensation. What you find with both these types in Socionics, they have that fluid interplay between both extroverted intuition and also introverted intuition. They've got their creative function and their demonstrative function, both intuitive. So both, not only are they considering everything very much in depth because of their introverted intuition, they're taking a while to think things through properly, but they're also considering alternatives to what they are trying to think of and come up with. So they'll not only have spent a long time really thinking out the outcomes of whatever decision they're making, they're then saying, but what if it were wrong? What if you consider that instead? And so then they drop what they're doing and consider another route. And while they're continuously doing this, they have no extroverted sensation. So they never quite go to the action of, okay, I've decided, let's do it.
Right.
And so permanent indecision is something you can see with the LIIs and the EIIs, the analysis paralysis.
I could also see it as if we think of kind of the either or of introverted sensing, I could see it as right, the impossibility of being sure on the one hand, or I'm like almost like completely settled, like some INTP physicists being kind of almost proud in their way that they see the world and being like, no, it is not open to revision. And that's the kind of like settled thing that happens with the INTP. It's like, no, it's like it's over. Like everybody leave philosophy. I drop the mic. Like get out of here. But yeah,
I think some LIIs can get at that. There's almost always within introverted logic, where whereas stuff like how they actually feel about things, what their identity is, who they are, what that's about, that can be still a place of indecision in terms of then rooting it down to facts and realities. But once they know their field and they have their ideology or structure in the field, then yes, you could certainly see that. I find they still could invite alternative points of view more than say an LSI. And I have known LIIs who have still spent a lot of time really trying to think through alternative points of view without actually setting out an absolute, this is definitely the way, there's no questioning it, unless they're really sure on their principles. It's often quite hard, I think, then to get to that point.
Right. But, and I would map that onto, so being rigorous with identity, it's like you can judge more things at once when you're rigorous with identity. But if you're not rigorous with identity, if you're rigorous with the expressions, then you have to judge way more things. There's way more for you to consider as an INFP. That's how I think about it.
And is that, just to confirm, what are the rules by which one is rigorous with identities or rigorous with expressions? What does that map to, that rigor?
Oh, so rigor with identity, I call introverted thinking or introverted logic. Rigor with expression, I call extroverted thinking or extroverted logic, or yeah.
Okay, I see. So both logics are rigor, and
logics are rigor, yeah, and the feelings are merciful. So merciful with expression is extroverted feeling for me, and then merciful with identity is introverted feeling for me.
Okay, so in which case, someone who in the 4-function stack is rigorous of identity is by deduction merciful of expression. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay, makes sense. It becomes almost like a values thing. Makes sense. We have a different, it sounds a bit like it could map a bit to our idea of inert versus contact, or I like to call it stubborn versus flexible. And that's where one's much less likely to change one's mind on a particular point. Whereas actually being quite flexible and yielding in certain other areas. Like, for instance, we find that, as you talk about the LII, being actually quite particular about their structure, their framework, but they are still actually quite movable on, say, the mood in the room around them.
That makes sense.
And they're often quite movable in terms of what possibilities are actually to be explored around their structure. If you take, say, an Eilis, on the other hand, you can't really tell an Eilis what to be interested in. They will find what they're interested in, and they won't have that limited. But actually, or conversely, they won't often let other people expand it for them. They are the one doing the expanding of their interests.
Maybe.
Sorry, my dad came in.
That's okay.
Yes, no, and then we have, and that gets into how I think about what I call the immoderate function. That would be the last function, the opposite of the dominant function. I forget what it's called in socionics.
We call it suggestive.
Suggestive function. That's the dominant function of a dual type for me.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Right. Okay. Cool.
Let's see. Any other questions? Random name is saying, how can identity be divided into those 4 categories, like sensory identity, intuitive identity, ethical identity, and logical identity? I think you've already answered this before, but if you could just reiterate for random, that might be helpful for him.
Can identity be divided into those 4 categories, like sensory identity, intuitive identity? Yes, absolutely. I wouldn't say ethical identity. There is not a separate category of identity that applies to ethics. Things are identities and expressions, and it's like an extroverted intuitive type. They understand identities by seeing more expressions of those identities. But for an introverted intuitive type, they don't need more expressions of an identity to understand an identity. They look at one expression and they say that's the identity. So there's I guess no random name, like there is no intuitive identity. It's just identities and expressions, and then intuition and sensation, how they split into extroversion and introversion. It's a question of quantity. It's a question of the relationship between heaven and earth, of the relationship between identity and expression.
Okay.
And then identity with logic and ethics, it's kind of like there's not a separate mountain. It's just, where does this stuff belong on the mountain? And there are 2 different mechanisms for determining where stuff belongs on the mountain. That's how I think about it.
I think something like a video of actually a drawing or a picture.
Yes, absolutely. I need to come up with that.
That'll be good. Let's see, where else? More questions. Updom Plates is saying, if I'm not mistaken, TI judgments are external, meaning explicit, and FI judgments are internal, which is implicit. Yep, pretty much. You are correct. I think so. Okay. Any more questions here? Is John also Eilis? Yeah, John identifies as Eilis. Ergo is saying, the way you described introverted ethics just before sounds like its user dismisses how X contact feels about their mutual closeness, as if FI ego is prioritizing their own boundaries. Yeah, I would say at the end of the day, if an ESI or EII doesn't like you, they're not going to be so worried about whether you like them back or not. Although if an EII does like you, I know EIIs who very much, they may even ask the person, do you like me? It'll be actually quite an important thing to them that the people they like also like them. But I've also seen other EIIs who actually may have said that actually don't. Actually, no, I've seen EIIs actually. So not EIIs, so not introverted ethics leading, but introverted ethics demonstrative, who have actually said they've liked someone and actually not really minded if they don't like them back. But it's like sort of the image or the idea of the person, and it does not actually important to them that then turns into a mutual relationship. So
interesting.
Let's see. Anything else here? Ahmed has asked, did you guys mention introverted sensation overlaps and differences between 2 systems? We didn't really go into introverted sensation. Any thoughts on that?
I think there's a really good intuition in Socionics about environment and comfort in environment. But I think Socionics might keep some of the subjectivity, the questions of subjectivity, when they talk about introverted sensing, because I think there is an introverted sensing aspect to everything. There's an earthly aspect. It's like introverted sensing perceives identity through expression, right? That's how I think about it. Like, it's like, so extroverted intuition it's trying to understand an identity. So it perceives a bunch of stuff lower on the mountain that's related to that identity. That's the inclusion of more data. That's the inclusion is the extroverted part of that. But then the move that introverted sensation makes is like, once it has all that data, it solidifies it. It just looks at it and it takes it as one big mountain. So it's almost like intuition is the function that like makes the mountain. It makes the connections that make the mountain. But then sensation just steps back and says, "Oh, it's like, oh, there's the mountain." Does that make sense? Like, I don't know. I'll have to like make a video about that separately.
I've seen other people use sort of rock-based analogies before, and for them, they've gone into, oh, the intuitor sees the mountain, the sensor starts seeing the rocks around the mountain, or the rocks making it up, and the different pieces.
But I think with introverted sensation, you have to understand that it's perceiving identity. So it's like perceiving the whole mountain. It's perceiving like, yeah, it has a really weird like, and that's why we talk about it as impressionistic. Sometimes it's like,
yeah,
it perceives that identity. It's so ineffable to the introverted sensation type, because it's like it's full of sense data. It's not full of like something you can say.
I definitely don't disagree with you. I think there's certainly a quality to introverted sensation and also introverted intuition, which is perhaps ineffable. And the reason why I think it is perhaps ineffable is because of the dynamic and static dichotomy going into it. So it's the thing, when it comes to perceptions, it's the other way around. The introverted elements are dynamic, the extroverted elements are static. So what's that like? Extroverted perceptions like this and this and this and this and this and this and this, lots of things to acquire. Whereas for introverted perception, it's more about refining the overall feel of it, or the overall impression of it. So if you do it in terms of intuition, it's not about chasing possibilities. It's finding those ideas which you feel are definitely going to lead to something. There is something going on here. There is a path. There is a purpose. But that's a bit ineffable, you could say. What parts make it that path? No, it's not about the parts. It's about the whole.
Right.
Same way for sensation. It's not about the parts. It's not about that thing in the room. It's about the overall feel of a room. Is the overall feel of a room relaxing? Is it comfortable? Is the overall process working well? Is it in harmony? Are there grinding of gears? It's about the relationships between the many different things in the room creating that overall impressionistic feel, not about any particular thing in the room pushing up against any other thing in the room. Whereas you go to extroverted, it is about each individual thing in the room. Extroverted sensation, I want that thing. I want that thing.
Right. Totally.
It's not about the overall effect on the field. I think that's why in sociology we're talking about objects versus fields. It shows up most well, I think, in the introverted, irrational, or dynamic elements. So I do this field, an abstract, meaning-based field, or a more concrete, sensory, feedback-based field. Homeostasis.
No, yeah, homeostasis is a fantastic way of thinking about. Well, wait, I think you're saying about introverted sensation. Yeah, that's a fantastic way of thinking about it. But yes.
Okay. Detached is asking, who would John consider benchmarks of types?
I think my opinion on that is has a religious. There's an aspect of religion to that answer, because I think there is no path within. There's no path within the personality system itself that shows you how to be your best type, because I think the personality system is descriptive. I think you have to have a kind of like there are other means to becoming who you should be, and my general means are some kind of spiritual path. So when I try to find like benchmarks of a type, I look for saints that are that type. Saints in the Catholic Church in my tradition. an INFP benchmark for me is Saint Therese of Lisieux. An ENFP benchmark for me is Saint Augustine. An INTP benchmark is Saint Thomas Aquinas. An ENTP benchmark would be Saint John of the Cross. Yeah, that's how I think about it. I don't have a full 16 saints for each type though, so I need to work on that.
Which one was Aquinas again? So I didn't hear the type again.
INTP.
Yeah, we came to that decision.
Yeah, cool.
We came to LII for him. Yeah, very good. Gentle Giant. Yeah, very definitely a big guy, not an aggressive guy, and far more intellectually focused, certainly. Yeah. Let's see.
Oh, you're talking about Aquinas. I thought you were talking about someone in the chat. Yes. Gentle Giant.
Yeah. Zeno. What is INFJ and INFP? Well, speaking of philosophers, Zeno, what is INFJ and INFP relation is like since they're quasi-identical? How do we understand each other? I can talk about my point of view, see if John has a different point of view. I would say, like all quasi-identicals, they're similar in their strengths and their weaknesses. They're both not very good at taking immediate action, not very good at figuring out how to do things most effectively, especially not in the immediate moment. They're not improvisers. They are very good at reflecting on how they feel, what feels more meaningful, where are things going, how are things going to be. They can quite easily pick up almost the future shelf life of relationships around them as well. Where that's going to go, is that going to go somewhere? Now, where they're different is a difference in their delta and beta values. So I'd say that an EII is focusing on personal growth, personal development of themselves, of people who are close to them as well. They are interested in the change within, living up to their potential as a human being. They can have quite a strong sense of what their character is and how they're living up to it. Whereas the IEI in Socionics, a bit like INFJ, can't treat in the easy one-to-one correlation, but a lot of cases it does work. They are far more externally focused in terms of where they want the change to be, is what I think betas have in common. In the way they want their identity to be reflected in the world in some way. They want to maybe have a platform for which their ideas and their points of view can actually be espoused, can touch and affect people in some sort of meaningful way. Or they want to really get to some sort of real truth of the world that can then be communicated, that can then be become influential in some way. So I think that's the main difference between them, the external and internal focus of change for betas and deltas. And yeah, they have different needs in the world. The EII or INFP is looking for extroverted logic. They want to be shown how better to do things. They want to be validated in that feeling of their competence. Am I really capable of doing things? Whereas the IEI, they're looking for extrovert sensation. And that validation is more, I want to have that will to actually make things, the important things happen, to drive things forward, to have that vivacity and be around people with that dynamic energy, to get me out of my sort of indecision. So I think those are the differences between them in terms of how they relate to one another. I'm not someone who takes the point of view that intertype relations perfectly describe how people interact. I think this is where we have this idea of these theoretical interactions, and to some degree, I think a lot of them make sense. For instance, I think duality makes sense in terms of its attachment to scientific literature, because one of the findings of diversity, research on diversity, does diversity make teams better? Well, yes and no. Certain kinds of diversity are very good for teams working together, and that's the cognitive diversity. That's differences in strengths, differences in experiences. Multidiscipline teams, for instance, are fantastic when you get them to work together, because then you got all your weaknesses covered by other people. When there's a strong difference in values, if you had the worst case scenario is when you have the team split into two of incontrovertible issues, and they're completely different viewpoints on that matter. There's no peaceful remake coming together again. It often leads to a split or a rift, and productivity grinds to a halt. So that is where I actually say you want values, what we think is right, what we think is wrong, etc., to be united, but you want the skills and capabilities to be very, very different. I think that works brilliantly in duality. I think that duality is, out of different relationships, the one which is the most supported in its hypothesis by the available evidence in the literature. But when you go into certain others, like how exactly does a quasi-identical interact? What we really have are what the theory would suggest. Oh, well, this could interact with this to create that, and we can put together different speculations of what that might look like in real life. And then you can then fill in those gaps based on your own anecdotal experiences. Oh, I know that person and that person, they interact in that way. I've seen the same pattern across here. And if you share those same patterns with someone else who's seen the same thing, maybe that's the start of something to put together. But there hasn't been any strong evidence base to prove this is how quasi-identicals will interact. All I would say from my own experiences, limited to the anecdote, is that I've had best friends who were quasi-identical, and also had father figures who are my quasi-identical, and even my boss at one point. And depending on the person, I know there's a difference in values, there's a difference in our expectations of the world at the end of the day, but also because we tend to like the same interests, we tend to find ourselves in similar environments. So applying that rule to INFJ and INFP, you'd expect people who find themselves in the same sorts of environments because of the same sorts of strengths, but they'll find that they're ultimately not looking for the right thing at the end of the day. And the closer they spend time together, they might find sudden surprises about what each person is looking at. You want this? I'd have no interest in that. I want this. But it's not as sharp of a clash as, say, the extinguishment relation, which we say an EII and an EIE, like INFP and ENFJ, where that would be more everything which is inert, is stubborn for the other person. So there's very little give or flex between the two. So that's what I'd say about that. It would be difficult for me to go into exact examples without them being limited to those particular examples and showing out the concrete examples, the concrete aspects of that example. It may not apply to people in other circumstances because it's an abstract idea that we have to apply in different manifestations. Any thoughts, John?
That's brilliant. That's all brilliant. I agree with pretty much all of that. That's good. Yeah, I find, so anecdotally, I find my experiences with my quasi-identical type, it's kind of like what you were saying. It's like we're in the same area, we're in the same field, but then it's like at some point it's like we really want different things. It's like I think it's time for us to part ways. Like that's been my experience. But I mean, it's not always the experience. It's like sometimes that even that diversity of what you want can almost I think it can be something that even makes a relationship stronger. I'm a big believer in kind of like any of the relationships can work, specifically romantically, because that's what people are always concerned about. It's like, oh, I like this person. It's like, should I date them? I don't know. It's like, no, I think every relationship can work, and I think there's downfalls to every relationship. I really love Socionics for the intertype relationships. That's why I got into it in high school. Yeah, I think the Mirage relationship is odd. I see that relationship all the time. Like I always see people in Mirage relationships, and I'm like, it's super fascinating.
Although I remember you said 5 years ago, you didn't. I remember what you said 5 years ago. Goodness gracious me! I just remember watching it for you again today. That you've seen lots of examples of INFJ Entp, but not so much of ESTJ INTP.
I've totally changed on that. I see that all the time now. And now that I know what to pay attention for, like, yeah, I see it.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it is quite common. I think illusionary is quite a common pairing. I actually haven't seen a lot of it recently, but just from past experience, I think it is quite a common one. Another thing I'd say is, depending on, you got the socionics relationship, then you've got the circumstantial relationship, which is equally important, understanding what's going to happen. So what I mean by that is, let's say your relationship with your father or your mother is going to be completely different to your relationship with your boss. It's going to be very different to a relationship with a friend who you share an interest with. So, and there'll be different tensions that can come up. So I'd say quasi-identical may be harder with a parent because that's when value clashes become a lot more pronounced. Whereas if your friend is someone who you both play chess together and you like talking about chess together, quasi-identity is not, in my opinion, going to make that hard. I think that's a very sustainable relationship. One of my best friends, he's quasi-identical, but we talk for ages about stuff because we happen to be good at communicating in those fields, in those areas, even if we may have ultimately very different viewpoints in terms of who our romantic partners should be, and in terms of what we actually like in terms of our communication. As long as we know each other well enough to adjust to each other in that respect, we can talk about the subjects which interest us for hours on end and be lost in it. And that's, I'd say, probably a very healthy relationship. We really enjoy each other's company. And that's, at least as far as I'm concerned, that's what counts. Yeah.
That's great. Oh, I think I gotta head out.
Yeah.
It was great to talk to you, Jack. I feel like I learned a lot. I feel like I said some things that I didn't understand before I said them, and this was great. So thank you for having me on.
John, thank you for coming on and explaining a bit more as well about identity and expression, and some of that, also the theological underpinnings of that. I look forward to uncovering more of your ideas over time and giving your channel more attention than I have so far. So thank you so much for coming on here. I'll put a link to your channel in the description as well so people can access it.
Cool. Thank you.
But yeah, thank you, and have a lovely rest of your weekend.
You too, man.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a lovely rest of your weekend too. Bye-bye.